So we are really pleased to have Michael here. Our poet this evening is Michael McDowell. Michael is the author of the book of poetry, The 100-Year House. So he does have copies of his book, and so you'll be able to get that after the reading. I've really met Michael through Bill Siverly and through Windfall Magazine. Michael and Bill Siverly have co-edited Windfall Magazine, which is a journal of poetry of place since 2002. Michael's work appears in Windfall regularly. His prose about nature and landscape writing has also appeared in the anthologies The Eco-Criticism Reader, Reading the Earth, and 50 Key Thinkers on the Environment. Of the 100-Year House, Robert Michael Pyle has written, "Awake to the land, its life, and their working parts as only the lucky young discover them." Michael McDowell tells his wonderfully varied tales with wit, whimsy, and devastating aim. He's a graduate of Stanford University with a PhD from the University of Oregon. He taught literature and writing at Portland Community College for 35 years. He lives in Portland, Oregon. Would you welcome our poet for tonight, Michael McDowell?
All right, well, thank you, Tom, and the Poetry Committee, and Leading Library, and City of Milwaukie, and thanks to all of you for coming tonight as well. A large part of Windfall, a journal of poetry of place, this is the issue that just came out this spring, that Bill and I have thought about before starting the magazine and kept in mind as we've chosen pieces for it, is to develop greater attention to the environment, the landscapes in which we live, both built and natural landscapes, and think about how we choose to interact with the landscape. Well, the poems that I'm going to be reading from The 100-Year House and other poems that I've written since it came out aren't about places in particular, but on one level at least, there's always some element of that I'll ask you to kind of listen to, because it changes a little bit the meaning of the poem. I'm going to start off with the poem that was on the broadside, Burnt Toast. The cover of The 100-Year House is the house that my great-grandfather built on the Long Beach Peninsula in 1883. And a lot of the poems in here are about our spending summers there as we were growing up. The painting on the cover was discovered when an aunt of mine was in a stationery store and found stationery with that painting on it. Somebody had driven by and thought it was a really picturesque house and painted it. So I asked the artist if I could use it for the cover. She agreed. Part of what makes it an interesting house is that nobody, because it was a family house that like 100 people owned a piece of, nobody put any money into it. And so my grandfather finally wired it in 1920, and nobody did anything to the wiring ever after. And so that's what we grew up with. And everything was antique, including the toasters. They were A-shaped toasters. You pull down, put toast in, and then you have to remember that you put toast in. So, burnt toast. At breakfast, the old toasters sat at either end of the table, one next to the spoon jar and one next to the sugar jar, chrome-plated steel on yellow oilcloth. The sides leaned together to make an A, like hands praying. We lowered each side, put in the bread slices, closed the doors, and watched the coils glow. Early morning, distracted by wood stoves, siblings, comics, and talk, we'd smell and then see a pillar of smoke rising from the praying hands. A sacrifice bumping against the sooty heaven of the kitchen ceiling, signaling we'd failed. in our vigilance and not open the door in time. Then we'd scrape the black cinders into the sink. On such occasions, my grandfather would say, "I've always liked my toast a little charred." So we learned to accept the black specks on jellied toast, like the burnt tapioca and black-bottomed cookies, expecting no sweetness without ashes in the mouth. The Long Beach Peninsula has a lot of standing water, which means a lot of mosquitoes. And so this poem, Coastal Forest Mosquitoes, Cape Disappointment, is about a hike along the bluff overlooking the Columbia River estuary on a trail called the Coastal Forest Trail. On our arms and legs, constellations form, unique as freckle patterns. Each bite, our donation of blood to the next generation of larvae. On the Baker Bay Trail, the bites multiply as fast as we pull the red huckleberries into our metal cups. My daughter wears nubs of horns on her forehead, 2 rounded buttes, east and west. At McKinsey Head, mosquitoes as big as Anna's hummingbirds hover by neck and cheek and hand. My son has itched and scratched and rubbed his legs into ranges of red-cratered volcanoes. So we enter the landscape, leaving our blood living in others. Our human cells flying past Sitka and Salmonberry to places we'd never go. At evening on the porch, as we count and compare our new coins of raised flesh, mosquitoes wing from the wax myrtles and pines to our waiting arms and legs. One of the nice things about spending summers at the beach, as one of 6 children with mother taking care of us in this small house and our father in Portland, was that she basically said to leave and just come back by dinner, and you can't burn down a beach. And so go ahead and take matches and newspapers and have a fire. And so all of us kind of turned out to be pyromaniacs because we could go down. At that time, there was a lot of wood coming down the Columbia River and washing up on the beach, and it was easy to do. So that's a tradition, and that we've carried on through the generations. This poem, Beach Bonfires, partly about, or part of the intention is to emphasize how we create memories associated with particular places that make the places more significant to us. Those ideas, those feelings, those connections have to be passed down from generation to generation, or else subsequent generations will not respect or recognize the value of the landscape. Beach bonfire. After sunset, we walked north, my children pushing bicycles through dry sand, till we came to driftwood logs and built a fire. Families flying kites in the twilight packed and left. The clouds flew off northwest to southwest, and darkness settled around the flames whipping in the wind. Because we sang the right songs for this northern beach, songs my mother's mother taught her, and told the old stories with our toasted marshmallows, hundreds of stars came out. The surf crashed louder, and the lighthouse on North Head 3 miles away winked especially for us. As the bonfire turned to coals, our water bottles of ocean water with fierce hiss and steam plunged us into darkness. My daughter said, "Look, the waves are glowing." In the booming black night, Every cresting wave's white foam glowed phosphorescent as a Halloween glow stick. It's millions of tiny sea creatures, I said, each giving off light. We walked south along the night beach, patterns of light glowing, shifting, crashing. On the deserted road home, my children bicycled in front, and I followed with my headlight on their backs. They glowed in the darkness, small creatures turning and shifting, and for a moment filled with song in the darkness. So we'll move from the beach to the mountains. This is Julia at Lost Lake, Mount Hood National Forest. We were canoeing, and I took a photograph and stared and stared and stared at it afterwards, and then decided that I would try to get every detail in the photograph into a poem. So there are a lot of images. Julia at Lost Lake, Mount Hood National Forest. She cups blueberries in her hand as if they were a broken-winged bird, which she eats morsel by morsel. Long coils of her light brown hair twist and curl down her shoulder, across the orange life vest tied loosely in front. 10 years old, she's comfortable and confident, standing above the old town canoe beached by the blueberries in the volcanic gravel of the far shore. At her bare feet in the water, blue dragonflies, rough-skinned newts, kokanee probe and vanish. Alder and Devil's Club crowd the shore at her shoulder. In the distance, ghost trees here and there whiten the dense green hemlock August. From her own palm she plucks and tastes the world, and then shakes remnant leaves and stems like confetti, and climbs in to fly across white caps and swells to the waiting dock. This poem is an update of Christopher Marlowe's The Passionate Shepherd to His Love, which, as you might recall, starts off, "Come live with me and be my love." So this is The Passionate Hiker to His Love, updated for my wife, Janice. Come hike with me and be my love, and you will know the trails of Oxbow Park, waterproof, windproof, and breathable. For I have bought you a Gore-Tex parka of 1,000 threads per inch. They susurrate like wind in Sitka spruce. A draw-cord waist and ripstop fabric and easy opening underarm vents. If these pleasures may thee move, come hike with me and be my love. Who has patience has all things. L.L. Bean ships the 17th. Then live with me and I will be your waterproof, windproof, whispering love. So lately, one of the biggest differences in backpacking and hiking in general is the movement from carrying a lot of heavy objects to ultralight hiking due to technological developments and a movement toward being a little less safe and a little less burdened. So you have to make a lot of concessions about what you leave behind. But this is called ultralight backpackers, Mount Hood Wilderness. They brag like 6-year-olds. My base weight is lighter than yours. It's no longer just sawn off toothbrush handles and margins cut off the topo maps. Now it's a single titanium pot to boil water for a freeze-dried meal eaten from the bag with titanium spork. Still hungry, drink some olive oil. Goodbye, white gas and Optimus cook stove with your brassy good looks and fiery roar. Denatured alcohol in a soda can bottom now quietly heats the water to hydrate our food. 5 squares of toilet paper a day. Who needs more? Flashlights stay home. Hands-free headlamps the size of tangerines grow from foreheads to create all the necessary glow. Ditch the tent, a tarp's all you need, and the mosquitoes sleep with a head net on. Wear earplugs, you don't hear 'em. Camp on ridges windward sides. The ultralights breeze past on the trail, swift as trail runners as we plod onward, weighted with what's needed for the wind, rain, impalings, burns, and fractures my daughter and I might suffer. Instead of water bottles, they carry plastic bladders which curl into the size of a cigar with the weight of a butterfly. They flutter past into a carefree dream of eternal sunshine, warm breezes, and soft starlit nights. So I have a few poems about family that I'm going to read. The first is entitled The Meaning of Things. We've, in dealing with environmental issues, have fought somewhat against the privileging that Western society has made since Plato of ideas over things, of the perfect form rather than the imperfect physical manifestation. And all that we really ultimately depend on are concrete physical manifestations of things. So this plays with that idea a little bit. The meaning of things. Res rei, Latin, a thing, object, a matter, an affair, a circumstance. Sundays meant the hard pine pews in the transept. No cushions for Catholics, just straight back boards. Our St. Joseph Daily Missal gave us, in ornate red and black, Latin on the left page, English on the right. I sat by my mother as long as I was the youngest child. She, bored by the service, pointed out cognates and translated individual words. Pater, father. Caelum, heaven. Domus, house, where I wished we were. To watch her translate porcus and ovum and panis into breakfast. 14 slices of bacon, eggs sunny side up, and toast mounded with strawberry preserves, spooned from an Empress Hotel golden can. Now, as I stir more broth into the risotto on the stove, my son, whose college curriculum has become French and German, Swedish, Arabic and Greek, Italian and Latin and Russian, asks, as if he's forgotten, what's the genitive singular of race? Rei, I remember, race, rei, like in reification, to make something abstract into something real. The Western fantasy that ideas precede physical reality, that privileges abstraction over the natural world. And here I am, making risotto turn dinner into reality. The garden roses on the table make this June, and the spoken sounds we send across the evening meal make family a reality continuing from those breakfasts long ago. So, another food poem. As most of you are probably aware, the Catholic Church for many years made it a venial sin to eat meat on Fridays. And so We could not have bologna in our sandwiches that we took to school on Friday. And my mother cooked fish. She was the black bottoms on the oatmeal cookies, burnt saucepan that the tapioca was cooked in kind of cook. And my father usually ate out on Friday nights. But we had fish, overcooked, tasteless fish on Friday nights. This is called Fish on Friday. The bones terrified us. We had heard the stories. A child took a bite of fish, swallowed, and the bones, like flexible toothpicks, lodged in his throat, tiny hammocks for that eternal rest. Our mother served us fish every Friday. White fish, 3 bones per bite, 30 bones per meal. We laid the little white needles of death on the plate's rim, each bone a tally of disaster averted. February brought Candlemas and the blessing of candles. The next day, the feast of St. Blaise, we knelt at the communion rail for the blessing of our Friday fish-eating throats. A mother had brought to Bishop Blaise and laid at his feet her only child, choking to death on a fishbone stuck in his throat. Though on the way to prison and his own beheading, St. Blaise stopped, said a prayer, and straightway the child was saved. At the communion rail, the priest pressed against our necks 2 candles tied by a ribbon into a V, and said under his breath a prayer that we be spared the choking fate that seemed all too likely, but for the intercession of St. Blaise. Each Friday at dinner, we stared at the fish spiked with bones, crumbled it, and carried to our lips forkfuls of perhaps our last meal, mindful of the choking children of the world and the absence of saints passing by on their way to prison and beheading. As Tom said, I taught for 35 years at Portland Community College, mostly at the Sylvania campus in southwest Portland, which, like most colleges built in the 1960s, was very heavy on concrete. When the campus opened in 1968, the Oregonian likened it to a series of bunkers, and that's kind of what they are. This poem is kind of a grandiose fantasy that I wrote as my retirement began approaching last year, with echoes of Yeats's Lake Isle of Innisfree near the end. It's called CT Building. The buildings had abbreviations, and everything was supposed to be job-oriented, technology-oriented. So CT, where the English department and art department taught, is communications technology. So CT Building, Portland Community College, Mount Sylvania. Unpainted concrete slabs rise above bark dust and hang over sidewalks encircling the building. It's what a freeway overpass might look like if it decided to become a building. For 35 years, I've sprinted up its stairwell, plodded back down a half dozen times a day. One day, I'll trip and with outstretched arms bounce down the steps into the student lounge at the base. I will lie on my back, staring at the skylight above the stairwell, as language tutors and students, speaking Spanish and Japanese and Farsi, gather like cherubim at the edges of my sight. For 35 years, I've breathed its air, pulled in through a giant intake along the street, and vented upon us fumes of idling diesels, outdoor smokers, art students' paints. On this wooded hillside of a dead volcano, in a bunker amid groves of Douglas fir and big leaf maples, I've coached the meek, the mild, and the mouthy to read for what they call the hidden meanings, and to write. One day, I will arise from my desk in the windowless office and go to the entrance of this ash-gray bunker, where I will roll away the stone and step into the sunlight dressed in shining garments. So that did happen last June, finally. And within a couple of weeks of retiring, I was at the beach bicycling. And this poem is about what I learned when I ended up skidding my bicycle and lying flat on my back and letting the landscape talk to me. The Discovery Trail, North Head Lighthouse, Washington Coast. I braked my bicycle on the gravel at the lighthouse, glowing golden in the sunset. Lines of pelicans skimmed the waves, and cormorants dived for salmon from rocks below. Coasting home down through the darkening woods, I rounded a corner and surprised a bear. Its giant haunches lurched down the trail like black velvet tablecloths flapping in a gale. The bear ran into bushes along the path and stood upright, showing black ears and nose behind purple foxglove stalks. I needed to pass. I stood astride my mountain bike, waiting. He finally bolted down the trail and, at a bend, stopped and turned and took a step closer. His back hunched pure black against June green. We locked eyes 10, 15, 20 seconds. Certain he wouldn't advance. Still, I thought, if not death by lightning strike, why not by bear attack? A glorious end. Better than comatose days of open mouth, rasping breath, unblinking eyes. Then he dropped downhill. Next evening, my front tire slid out on lighthouse gravel. Lying under the bike, I listened to the noisy cormorants explain death, as commonplace and unremarked as swallowing a live fish with each splashing dive. So, not so glorious after all. So, a poem about death and gardening. It's another take on how we interact with landscapes. It's called Worms. Every Sunday I empty our kitchen compost into the worm bin. White cores of apples and pears mound atop green bean ends. Potato peelings lean against cantaloupe rinds and celery stalks. I arrange the potent mixture so the lid will fit. The next week, all that color has fled. The bumps and angles flattened over a smooth field of black castings for our garden. Hundreds of red wigglers crawl over one another, tasting last week's food again and again. Worms, my father would say, pouring gravy on his potatoes. In a grave, worms eat through your intestines, your eyeballs. They crawl out your lips. He'd shake his head at us children. And bugs everywhere, crawling and biting. For years, he paid $90 a month to buy a concrete crypt high off the floor in the Garden of the Apostles Mausoleum, marble-faced on a hilltop above the city. Sunlight slanted through the aisles. After embalming fluid replaced his blood and he lay in a blue cloth casket, I placed my hand on his forehead, as impenetrably cold and hard as the marble mausoleum walls. 16 years later, on a chill November day, we reopened his crypt to roll in our mother. His casket lay still in the silent shadows, its pale blue cloth intact, not a worm or bug in sight. The cemetery workers recalked and bolted the crypt closed. We went home to our everyday lives, and I told my children, bury me unembalmed and underground. We have worms to feed and gardens to grow. On the same theme, having dealt with funeral plans and been the executor, personal representative, taking care of the estate of my mother, father, and an aunt, I decided that I am going to take care of these things for myself so that nobody else is going to have to make all of these decisions. And so I went to Riverview Cemetery and had a discussion about how I could be environmentally sound in making all of my decisions. And so here it is, Green Cemetery Day, Riverview Cemetery, Portland. In the cemetery office, the counselor shows me options. I could be buried in this casket of willow branches, woven like a 6-foot-long Easter basket, and I could be the chocolate rabbit. Or I could choose a casket of woven seagrass and spend the afterlife floating like Moses along an underground river, exploring roots of bulrushes, grasses, and reeds. But wait! Do I want to be really green? Forget the casket baskets and their 2 years to decompose. There's a simpler option, a shroud on a board, cotton shroud, pine board. Not the kind of shrouds on tall ships, making a lattice work from rail to mast for sailors to hang on, high above the blue ocean en route to some tropical paradise. But a shroud like the famous Shroud of Turin, with its ghostly inhabitant. I could be sewn up and tucked away like the sachets of lavender and herbs my grandmother put into her dresser drawers. Green burial means no tennis shoes with their molded plastics, no boxers with elastic waistbands, and no shirts of cotton poly blends. Proper decomposition demands a dress code, cotton or wool. Then, strapped to a board and lowered onto a bed of hay, in my own eternal sleeping bag, I could listen all night for the worms and centipedes and beetles to visit and carry me away. Let's see. How am I doing on time? Should we do 2 more?
Yeah, keep going.
Could you handle another funeral poem? This is the new funeral. If you don't like the idea of lying down for your funeral, it's so awkward being the only person relaxing on pillows while everyone else stands around so formally. Or you don't like the idea of so many people hovering above who you hardly know, who you owe letters or dinners or thanks, with never another chance to make good. If you don't want to be that lazy, lounging about body in the coffin, Louis Charbonnet of New Orleans will put you back on your feet, no matter that you're dead. You want your children to remember 30 years of dinners you placed on the table every evening at 6? At your funeral, you could stand mid-stir, hunched over a steaming pot on a stove. You don't want people looking down on you at your funeral? Mr. Charbonnet can stand you up, hands on your walking cane, derby tipped stylishly, a faint smile playing on your lips. Say you've just been shot to death. Stand tall, tethered to a post with boxing gloves raised, ready to take on the world again. Or, in this time of grief, Mr. Charbonnet could put you at your kitchen table, coffee or beer or single malt in one hand and a cigarette between the fingers of the other, seeming to invite the world to sit with you to contemplate extinction of consciousness, body without spirit, and putrefaction, until it's time to climb into the coffin and seem to sleep. So each of those is a tableau that this funeral director did arrange at the request of the person who had died before they died. So, this is another poem in celebration of teaching English. It's a kind of form of villanelle, which is a poem form that calls for repeating 2 lines in a particular pattern. I couldn't quite manage the rhyme scheme, but it's got a kind of hypnotic effect whenever the form is used. It's about climate change. It's about, the subtitle is An Almost Villanelle in Celebration of Teaching College English, and it's kind of a... I loved being a college English instructor, except for one aspect of the job, which is what the poem is about. The title is, The Forecast Calls for Another Inch Today. Too many student papers weigh me down as I trudge up Mount Sylvania in a wet south wind. The forecast calls for another inch today. Books, composition, and coffee thermos so bulge my pack that the zipper has ripped from the fabric. Too many student papers weigh me down. Unread student work sits on my desk, 4 inches tall. I put up my hood against the downpour. The forecast calls for another inch today. My pack weighs 20 pounds this morning as I clamber over a tree newly toppled in the storms. A deluge of student papers weighs me down. Our utility room is flooded 3 times in 2 years. The downspouts cannot handle these heavier rains. The forecast calls for another inch today. The saturated ground can't take any more rain. In 7 weeks, I've read 672 papers. 40 years of student essays have weighed me down. The forecast calls for another inch today. So, I'll stop there. Thank you. So, any questions or comments anybody would like to make?
Well, you taught for a long time.
Uh-huh.
Who would you say were your favorite poets and that you liked to teach, and who influenced you? And is there any difference in those?
There are some poets who come across better in teaching than others. The more formal they are, often the better, because you can get a handle on what they're doing. The poets, it actually has changed over time. In the last 10 years that I taught, the demands from students were almost entirely for poets who are not white, not American necessarily, and come from some background that is new and different that we don't really know about, but we really should learn about. And form and qualities of poetry were really secondary to learning something different through the poetry. I like teaching. Well, Dylan Thomas always came across really well, and I like him a lot. Gerard Manley Hopkins influenced me a lot, but I didn't teach him very much because it was too complicated. It became increasingly hard to explain very complex issues, and I got happier and happier just to deal with the basics and introduce as many things that could be enjoyed as possible, because there's this desire on students' parts to get the message and to know really what the poet intended and what the poem is about. And my goal was simply to let a lot of it remain in darkness and just enjoy what you can enjoy from it. And these are some things that the poet's doing, and he's doing it to you, or she's doing it to you. Sharon Olds was one of my favorite and influenced me a lot. I think she is wonderful. John Keats long ago influenced me. He was right at the beginning of my college career. And there are probably 200 others that aren't coming to mind right now that I would have. If you didn't ask me, I'd know. I'd be able to write them all down.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you have a routine?
Well, the most standard routine in the last several years is that I belong to a poetry writing group, and we meet once a month, and we have to have a poem to show, and so I will write drafts of several poems, and finally one of them usually is pulled from something from the past when I was desperate to get a poem ready to show, and so I have hundreds of drafts of poems, and once a month at least I come up with one poem that I can show, and that happens usually in the week or two before we meet. Since I retired, I thought, I'll get up every morning and write. And I started doing that, and I ended up staring. I put words on paper, but none of it was very good. And so, another part of it was that bicycle skidding put me on crutches and out of commission for several months, and then into physical therapy for several months. And so I stopped doing things, and that didn't help at all. But when I've written a lot, I've done it usually before breakfast and first thing in the morning, and then edit it throughout the day or in the evening. And that's my best pattern. But right now, it's just seat of the pants. When I feel like something, I carry a notebook in my back pocket and take notes, and then those become poems eventually. Sparkly, yeah.
I noticed a lot of humor in your work that I didn't necessarily notice. I've looked at some of your book, The 100-Year House, and that didn't always come across. And then when I hear it, it really comes across. Is that something that's always been there, or have you developed that, do you think?
I don't try to be funny. It's just the metaphors that I come up with, which often are mixed, just are sometimes kind of funny when you think about it. But I was heavily influenced. I took a course once from a New York poet named David Shapiro one summer when I was in New York, and his mentor at the time was Kenneth Koch, one of the New York School of Poets, along with John Ashbery and James Schuyler and Frank O'Hara, and they're just totally filled with humor and bizarre, absurd, surreal images that play against each other, play off each other, and I really like that. And that's sort of I kind of outgrew surrealism because I thought it's not dealing enough with serious enough issues. I mean, you're always going to have a lightweight poet, not that my poetry has any great depth, but dealing with death and with climate change and with family and issues that are more substantive than if I were just playing with metaphor and being absurd. So it just comes out that way.
I'd be interested, since you've spent so much time at the beach, I'm wondering, since there's so much talk now about the coming tsunami and earthquake, if you've ever thought about kind of looking into that and expressing that, fears or whatever you feel.
Yeah, I've written several poems on the possibility of a tsunami, and there's actually one poem in here about the tsunami, and basically it's, okay, yep, it's gonna come, but here's dinner, and it's salmon, and it's really good. And that's one approach. Another one is, another poem I wrote on the tsunami, is about fear when you see the sign along the roadside of somebody futilely running up a hill at an angle like that from a wave 100 feet high. And it's entering tsunami zone. Okay, our house is in a tsunami zone. It's miles to go to get away from, to get above 7 feet above sea level. And so we have a red emergency pack that we'll put on and start running when we feel an earthquake. And that's about it. But yeah, as far as writing about it, yeah, there are more to do. It's every few months there are new reports on what a tsunami will look like along the coast, and it's just devastating. I mean, it'll be horrendous.
And here in the valley too. I mean,
Yes.
The earthquake will be big time here.
Yeah, as the New Yorker article last summer pointed out. Yeah,
Not only that article, but so many other things here online. You can find.
yeah. So it's something that we should be talking about more, because there are things we can do. Along the coast, what they say is to retrofit your house so that you're still alive after the earthquake and can run from the tsunami. And that's about all you can do. And then your house will, of course, be destroyed. But at least it will get you through the first half. But it's something I think about, yeah.
How
Yes.
long does it take you to write one of your poems? Do you do lots of editing and rewrites?
I do. It's embarrassing.
Fess up.
Well, I have many, many drafts of poems, and what I end up doing often is blending several of them together into a poem. But, you know, usually the first draft is a few minutes, and then it's just terrible. It's boring, even to me, but it has some ideas in it. And then usually over a period of weeks, I will add to it, and it'll every poem usually goes through at least 6 or 7 drafts, and then the writing group gets it, and I learn all these things that need to be done, and I walk home with my assignment, all these dozen things that need to be figured out and changed, and then that takes a few more hours to figure out in one way or another, or defend. So.
Any more questions for Michael?
Yeah, just one. Did you write those poems about funeral and death after you retired or before you retired?
Before I retired.
I have a question on that one too. What about cremation? Have you written about that?
I have one poem about an aunt of mine, the one who found this stationery. She was cremated, and the poem's about the Park Service not letting us do what she wanted, which was throw her ashes off North Head by the lighthouse. And they said, no human remains get left in the park. You can't do that. So we went to the beach right below the lighthouse. And what she wanted was, she had this 4 o'clock cocktail party every afternoon, 7 days a week on her porch at the beach, and everybody loved it. And it had to be at 4 o'clock so that all the women, especially, could leave at 5 and start dinner, because they had to be included. And so she wanted her ashes thrown off North Head, and then the south winds, usually a southwest wind, to blow her back for her 4 o'clock, 3 miles north. But it didn't work that way. The wind was blowing from the northwest, and it got all over all of us. And then we went back at 4 o'clock.
There's a scene from the Big Lebowski.
Yes.
That's what you do on the, yeah. That's how it works. Okay, well, thank you very much.